In the beginning, God was creating the heaven and the earth. The earth was a formless void of darkness covering the face of the deep, while a wind for God swept over the face of the waters. When God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and called the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "There will be a dome." In the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and morning the next day. Thank you.
And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let dry land appear." And it was so. That God called the dry land earth, and the waters were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that was good. And then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. Earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let the lights in the dome to give light upon the earth." And God made two great lights, the lesser light to rule the night, and the greater light to rule the day, and the stars. God set them in the dome to give light upon the earth and rule over the day and night and separate light from darkness. And God saw that was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day.
And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly from the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, of every kind with which the waters swam, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all of the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth."
God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and every other living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. There was evening and there was morning, the sixth day.
I have a reading from Genesis 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth. and there was no one to till the ground. But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and then he put the man whom he had formed. Out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the people should be alone."
The first parable that I ever heard Pete Rollins tell in person when he was in DeLand, it was a story about this woman who gets out of the shower and she's sort of wrapped in the towel, and she's got the towel around her head, and she's getting ready. Her husband's coming home from work, and the doorbell rings, and she's downstairs and he's upstairs. So she goes to the door, and it's the neighbor Joe. And she and Joe have always had this sort of like ongoing flirtation that's sort of bordered on inappropriate. So she answers the door, and Joe's like, "Oh my gosh," right? She's standing there in a towel. And she's like, "What's going on, Joe? How can I help you?" And he's sort of caught off guard. And he goes, "We've always had sort of this, this chemistry, and that I think you're beautiful. He like reaches in his pocket, he's like, I've got $400. If you take your towel off and just give a spin, let me have a look, then I'll give you this $400. We'll never talk about it again." And she's like, she takes a step back. She's like, "My husband is upstairs. I can't believe this." But then she's also like, "We got bills to pay, and like the kids got, And so she's like, she gets some clarity. She's like, "Just this once, we never talk about it again. Like, drop the towel, spin around, that's it." And he's like, "That's it, I swear." And she's like, "Okay, give me the money first." So she gets the money, drops the towel, spins around. She's mortified. She picks the towel up, like slams the door, runs back upstairs. They're getting ready, and she and her husband are talking. And he goes, "What was that about? Who was at the door?" And she goes, "Oh, it was Joe." And she has this sinking feeling. She's like, "I know he's going to ask, what it was about," but he doesn't ask. Instead, he says, "Did he bring the $400 he owes me?" So Pete. So Pete used this as an example of sort of the misunderstandings of what's called creation ex nihilo. So for this woman, it sort of feels like this circumstance was created out of thin air. Like she answers the door, and then all of a sudden there's this money that she didn't have, and then she's providing sort of this service, I guess you could call it. And so it feels like the circumstance came up out of nothing. But it's sort of a fiction, because the reality is it doesn't acknowledge that there were already stories going on underneath this. There was already debt in play. There was already currency in play. There was already sort of the chemistry that they'd shared in play. And so the argument that he makes is that there is no such thing as creation ex nihilo. There's no such thing as creation out of nothing. New beginnings, any kind of new beginning, good or bad, it's always a response in some sense to what is, a new way of being in response to context or circumstance. We take in what is, and then we respond. And sometimes we respond worse, right? Reaction. And sometimes we respond better. We can sort of have a tempered response and be wise and sort of weigh what's going on. But creation is not in a vacuum. It's always in some kind of setting, and often it's interactive with that setting. And so you sort of hear that in the story. For how many of us have new beginnings, these moments been in response to or the aftermath of a relationship with really devastating circumstances or suffering or loss or change? I think for a lot of people, when they look back on their life and they think about moments where things seem to have started over, much of the time, it's a really what we would call a negative circumstance. And so when we retell the stories, we use language like, "I would never choose to go through that again, but I also don't know that I would change it because it's made me who I am." Like suffering through that, learning from that new beginning, that starting over has sort of made me who I am. So I was at a funeral, not yesterday, a week ago Saturday, and it was this kid, 27 years old. He was in middle school in the first youth group that I ever worked at. And right after I started working there, he was diagnosed with this really, really rare and fatal form of cancer. And miraculously, he went into remission, and it sort of shocked everybody. And I was back and forth to hospitals, and he lost all his hair, did chemo and all this stuff. They did everything they could, and he went into remission. And so he finished high school, and he went to college, and he went to trade school, and he had been a heavy equipment operator for the county. And then just very recently, the cancer came back with a vengeance, and it killed him. There was nothing that they could do. And it shocked me that at this funeral, the thing that people talked about more than anything was his character. This 27-year-old. And what most of them said is that the person that he started to become after that first diagnosis was the thing that made him the kind of person that everyone wanted to hang out with. And the second thing they talked about most was his sense of humor. That this kid just had this infectious personality. People wanted to be with him, and it was the result of these things, horrific things that you wouldn't wish on any kid to go through. But it had made him who he is. So creation stories, not just Genesis, but the ones that are swirling around in the world in which the writers write the Genesis stories, they're dealing with sort of these huge cosmological realities about humankind. They're sort of probing who are we as people, answering why are we here. And over the course of development, the questions might have been like, what are the gods like? What is the pantheon like? And then with monotheism, like, what is God like? We might translate that today. What is the universe like? In what kind of world do we find ourselves? Sort of seeking this deeper story. So the contrast here is between stories being told already that were circulating at the time and the idea of offering in that space a new story. And again, this is a response to what is. And I think some of the most destructive thinking we do about how we receive the Bible is that there's somebody just like sitting there, right? And maybe they're a very faithful, pious person, and they get sort of like a tap on the shoulder, and God is like, hey, I have an idea for a creation story. Would you please write this down? Right? And then like with no external stimuli, they like sit there and write the book of Genesis. This like creation ex nihilo, as if that's the way inspiration happens, that doesn't take into account that people were telling creation stories all over in the area that Genesis was written at the time that it was written. So it's a response and in fact a challenge and a critique to hit on much of the conversation. Because it's begging the question, as people look at the world, as people hear stories about what the gods are like, they're asking these questions. Is the universe, are the gods, is the pantheon violent or loving? Is it destructive or generative? Is it dysfunctional or is it harmonious? Is it oppressive or is it one that empowers and lifts people up? Is it one of scarcity or one of abundance? These new beginnings always come from what is. And so Freddie did this awesome song that he brought. I think actually the first Sunday Freddie ever played music here, he did that song by Yusuf Islam, right? Right? Yeah. I was raised in Babylon, and we were talking through music, and at first the band was like, I don't understand how this fits with creation. So part of what we know now is that a lot of what informed and inspired the creation stories was the captivity of Israel in Babylon, because they learned Babylon's creation stories, right? And so the song is, I was raised in Babylon, meaning in exile, meaning not in Israel, meaning not with the temple, not in the land, not with God. I was raised in exile. I was raised in Babylon. I grew up not hearing my own creation story, but hearing the story of the Babylonians who captured me. So the Babylonian creation story is called the Enuma Elish. Scholars refer to it as the Babylonian Genesis, and this is great. It's a story about a highly dysfunctional divine family engaged in a major power struggle at the dawn of time. The heart of the story is one in which the god Marduk kills his nemesis Tiamat and then fillets her body in two, making the sky out of half and the earth out of the other half. And thus Marduk claims this highest throne as God in the pantheon. And this story shares, actually, a lot of concepts with the Genesis creation story because of that context. In both stories, matter exists when creation begins. Similar to Genesis 1 and the Enuma Elish, God is ordering chaos, not creating something out of nothing. And a lot of people, the way they want to read the Genesis stories is that, right, poof, it all just happens. But if you actually read the stories, there's matter, there's water, there's darkness. In the Enuma Elish, the symbol of chaos is this goddess Tiamat, who personifies the sea. Genesis refers to the deep and sort of these sea monsters as chaotic. The Hebrew word is tehom, which is actually related to that word Tiamat. In both stories, light exists before the creation of the sun and the moon and the stars. Where that light comes from, we don't really know, and it's not really our job to figure that out. In both stories, there's a division of the waters above and below. There's this barrier that holds back the upper waters. And if you read through, the sequence of creation is similar. And so the dividing of the waters, the dry land, the lights, humanity, rest, they all sort of occur in the same order. And then there's another one, the even more dysfunctional Canaanite mythology. Two brothers, Yam, who's the sea, and Mot, who's death. They battle their brother, Baal, who is just Lord, sort of a generic name. And they kill him, but his sister Anat raises him from the dead. And his father El eventually is enthroned as God. These should sound really familiar. A lot of the language in these should sound very familiar. You should be thinking to yourself, not only creation stories, but a lot of the things that we think of as most significant and unique to Christianity, these were around a couple thousand years before Christianity. And the point is, these texts are examples of the kinds of theological themes that pervade numerous cultures over many centuries, thousands of years before Christianity, before even the Jewish faith. And the stories aren't directly connected, but they share these common thinkings about the way things started. We could say they sort of swim in the same streams. They share these common ancient ways of speaking about the beginning of the cosmos. But I said Genesis, particularly, is a reply. It's resistance literature. It's pushing against sort of the stories that are being told. It's as if they're written to counter these misunderstandings or these distortions of primeval history, who we are and where we come from. And more specifically, the author is sort of pushing to rein in the Israelites, who they're writing for, because they're buying into these distorted worldviews that are being held up by their neighbors. And we can already pick up on several of the characteristics in these other myths. They're dysfunctional families, they're violent, they're oppressive, they're destructive, and there's this sense of scarcity that continues to fuel the power struggle, right? There isn't enough power to be shared in the pantheon, and so really what they have to do is kill each other till they find out who the supreme person is, and then they can sort of lord over everybody. On top of this, the creation of people in these ancient myths is incredibly dysfunctional. In this Babylonian one, Enuma Elish, the gods need someone, get this, to cater food for their orgies. That's why people are created. That's the creation of man in the Enuma Elish. They need caterers for their orgies and to clean up the mess afterwards. This is scholarly research. I swear to you. This is Peter Enns. This is a guy who, this is what he does for a living. So again, imagine, we have our Genesis story and we go, oh, this is about the creation of the world. This is in response to all these stories that were being told at the time about what the gods were like, what the universe was like, and the role of people, right? Why are we valuable as people? Oh, well, because you cater orgies and you clean up the mess, right? That's your lot in life. That's what you're valuable for. They're janitors, right? They're lackeys. And it even says in the Enuma Elish, it doesn't say they created humanity, they created savage man. Savage man. That's the story being told. And if the divine palace was not kept in proper order, the gods would be in a bad mood and they would wreak havoc on the earth. Maybe they'd send a flood or something like that. But in Genesis, the creation of humans isn't this divine afterthought. It's not this selfish utilitarian act. It's the opposite. It's sort of this building. It's the crescendo of the creation story. Humanity is the goal. It's sort of the apex of creative activity, and humanity's purpose is not dominion over the earth, right? To drill, 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 and to burn up all the resources and use it all for us. It's to care for and steward the planet. The idea is to co-create with God as the world flourishes. So again, we've got text, context. We've asked some good questions, kind of percolating. And I want to shift to kind of thinking about practice. And I just want to riff a little bit on the story so that we can think and sort of consider beginning stories as a call to being. And the first practice, I want to sort of frame up what we've been working on so far and flesh it out a little bit. I went to this conference this week, and it was about what's called design thinking. So the goal was to get 100 sort of young, innovative leaders from the United Methodist Church across 5 conferences. So it was just all over the Southeast. And we met in Tampa. And the bishops of these conferences basically said, your role here is to make us uncomfortable. We want to teach you design thinking, and then we want you to tell us about the future of the church, and we don't want to hear things we've heard. We don't want you to tell us to do things the same way we've done it because we all sort of agree that it's not working. So they sort of created this laboratory, taught us design thinking, and part of the reason that we got a seat at the table is because of you all, because you've let us make this laboratory where we can ask questions and fail and figure it out again. Caitlin actually got introduced in this conversation. The assistant bishop of our conference introduced her in front of some other very important people in the Methodist Church nationally and said, she works at Collective. It's the most innovative church in the Florida Conference. That's you all. Thank you. They have no idea that we're faking it and we don't know what we're doing. Every week, I'm like, there are people in this room again. I don't know what's going on. So basics of design thinking. And I just want to teach you the first two steps because I think this is what's going on in the creation stories, and I think this is actually could be a really, really formative practice, but it's not easy. So the first two steps of design thinking are to empathize and then to imagine. And they really focused on listening. So it maybe be like listening to ourselves, our intuition, or listening to the stories being told around us. So when we empathize, though, they gave us this really cool tool called an empathy map. And I'll just kind of walk you through it really quickly, and you can sort of run this framework. So you start by seeing. You might ask questions like, what is their environment like? What else does the market have to offer? And so if we run this over the sort of the context of the Genesis stories, what's their environment like? Volatile, dysfunctional, threatening. And then you look at what's being said and done. What's their attitude? What's the appearance? What's the behavior towards others? And again, threats, competition, maybe resources being exploited. Then you ask, how do they think and feel? These might be questions like, what really counts to them? What's their major preoccupation? What are the emotions that are tied to those things? And so in these circumstances, maybe placating the gods out of fear because you don't want them to send a flood, or placating the gods so that you get what you want, you don't lose what you have. Then you think about what you hear. This is more like one step removed. What do their friends say? What do their families say? Bosses, influencers, what is the media saying? And it's maybe that same message. If you don't serve these violent and volatile gods in the right way, you'll get whatever the opposite of creation is. You'll get smited, you'll get killed, you'll get punished, you'll get whatever. So that's sort of the environment at the time. And then the last one, pain and gain. So fears, frustrations, obstacles, wants, needs, what do they call success? And in this context, it would be play along, perpetuate the same broken system, play the game of sort of this violent pantheon. And the thing that they want, apparently, what led to the writing of the Genesis stories, was that they needed a different story. They needed something that was life-giving, that was generative. And so there's empathy, which is trying to understand what the people are feeling. And what I loved is they said design thinking is always primarily anthropological. It always starts with people. It can't be about innovation for the sake of innovation, and it can't be about developing technology for the sake of technology. It always starts with anthropology. You always have to listen to people, because that's when you find out what it is that people need. You've got to listen. So then after you've listened, after you've extended that empathy, you've listened to the stories that are being told, then you go on to imagine. And this is really sort of two questions. What if? Right? What if the universe wasn't primarily conceived of as a dysfunctional family and power struggle that inevitably resulted in violence and division and oppression? So you give yourself the freedom to ask that big question. What if Donald Trump wasn't president? Just asking a question. What if? What if? And then the next question is, I love this, they abbreviated it the whole time, HMW, how might we? And this is where it transitions from imagination to starting the design process, right? You start by imagining a world that's a little bit different. And then how might we? So how might we tell a story about God or the gods or the universe that's loving, that's creative, that's generative, that's wholeness, that's oneness, that's beauty, that's goodness? how might we tell a different story? And I love that they're smart enough that they don't tell such a different story that it's not recognizable. They use the language, they use the symbols, they use a lot of the same tropes that are used in all of the other ancient Near Eastern myths, but they use them in such a way that they tell a different story. And so this design thinking process, you shift then into designing and then acting. So it's empathy and then imagination, and then you design something, and then you act on it, which the writers of these stories obviously did. And their action was putting a new story into the world, or a couple new stories. And what I wanted you to see, though, is how they got here, because I think it's those first two steps that are the practice that we miss when we see new beginnings as some sort of miraculous do-over out of nowhere, or like external changes to circumstances, but not things that invite us to adjust our own character and our own formation and our own practice. So listening and imagining. We heard this great speaker, a guy called Andre Henry. He said, imagination is analogous. We can't create ex nihilo. We can't create what we haven't seen, is what he's saying, but we can imagine what we have seen being different, like it, but better. Like it, but better. So imagination is analogous. You can't imagine ex nihilo, right? If I tell you to sit here and go, imagine a better world, a lot of the way we start is with negatives, right? You can imagine a world where there's not hunger, where people are not thirsty, where there's not kids who are homeless, where there's not more sexual slavery and violence than there has been in the history of the world. We start with, I can imagine a world that's different because of the things that are absent from it. But again, it's analogous. I can imagine the world like it is, but better. And Andre is a young black man, and so he said, I can imagine a world in which 1 in 3 black men don't have to be incarcerated. I can imagine a world in which it's not 5 to 7 times more likely that I'll be arrested than my white counterparts for identical crimes. What if black men weren't arrested and incarcerated at these rates that are astronomically higher than others? And even more, what if mass incarceration wasn't just an accepted reality in the world we live in? How might we work towards a world that's less punitive and more restorative? How might we address socio-political issues that create this inequality and this inhumanity? How might we make space for conversations about addressing mental health before moving into locking people up? See, it's not that hard when you get started. You listen to the stories that are being told in our culture and you ask these 2 simple questions, right? You empathize. You really hear it, and you hear it until you're pissed. And you hear it until you feel it. That's how you know it's real empathy, right? Because anyone can quote statistics, but you've got to hear it until it means something to you, and then you start asking those questions. What if? What if we don't have to accept the same bullshit that we've been living with, right? And then you take a risk and you say, how might we? How might we? Is this easy? No. Hell no. And that's the point, right? And this is back to Andy's point. This isn't as simple as God said it, and then it was done, and it was 7 literal days, and then people got the world, and it's good, ta-da, right? The way we very often want to read these creation stories as this like very simple black and white, when in reality it's this deeply subversive, transformative counter-narrative. It's an imagination about the world that we might have. And this incites a dream that we've been wrestling with ever since. And we still haven't been able to figure this out. And Andre said, you have to tell a more complex story because simplicity breeds uncreative acceptance. Right? And Andy nailed it. We live in a world of headlines, and we love the clickbait. But very often do we read the whole article. Very often do we go do our own research on what's quoted in the article, and even more rarely do we pick up the phone and call someone and go, hey, I know we don't think the same on this issue. I just read this article and it's troubling. Could you shed some light on why you hold your particular position? Right? We don't want to know what we're talking about. We don't want to have an actual conversation with someone that disagrees with us. We want to load our news feed with everyone that agrees and props up the positions we already hold and then go, man, I feel really good because I'm right about everything. Right? How do things change? We're all very aware of the stories being told. Are we willing to do this sort of new beginning, recreative act of asking what if? Of asking how might we? So empathy and imagination. What stories being told, and then which ones are we resisting? Are we offering stories in their place? In subpoint to this, Caitlin nailed this a few weeks ago. She talked about liturgy as counter-narrative. That we're all liturgical beings, and whether that's how often you go to Target or what you do when you stand in line at Starbucks or the way you sort of do your morning routine, we're liturgical beings, right? We live in these rhythms and routines. And part of that is we expose ourselves with regularity to the stories that are being told about us, right? About we're never going to be good enough, and we're not lovable, and until we get that job or that relationship or that career or that house, then maybe we'll be somebody. We live in that constant stream of advertising, which is another way of telling us that we're not good enough. And liturgy as a counter-narrative is saying that one of the practices we can engage in is putting ourselves in environments like this and like community groups and conversations where we hear different narratives, where we choose to expose ourselves to stories that tell us that we're valuable. That we don't deserve the bullshit that people are telling us. We can listen to better stories. A couple other fun ones, and then we'll wrap up. So care for creation, and I think we already heard some good stuff about this, but just the difference between the traditional interpretation of having dominion over the earth versus what it means to care for and serve and preserve the earth, right? It's not to dominate and exploit. It's not to burn through resources because the earth is ultimately going to go up in flames anyway, but to learn what it means to care for creation. Bill and I had this interesting conversation at Occupy about the value of naming things. So we have in the story that the people name all the animals. And I was saying that for some reason, this is probably shaped by the story, well, not even the story, probably shaped by my understanding of the children's story of Noah's Ark, in which like the animals line up 2 by 2. For some reason, that made its way back into the naming story. And I think of God saying, hey, name all the animals. And so then they're standing in the garden and like the animals process by and they just go giraffe, donkey, whatever. Instead, I was like, man, what if they just in the course of their lives over 60 or 70 or 80 years, they practiced noticing. Right? What if it took them their whole lives to name things? What if it wasn't a conveyor belt, but just while they were living, they were like, oh, that's something new. I haven't seen that. I'm going to call that something. Right? Just sort of a sacred way of noticing, of looking around. And Bill said when he came into Trilogy, he's like, there's a palm tree out there. I've never noticed that palm tree out there ever until today. Like we've been doing this for a couple of years. But the idea of naming as maybe a practice in noticing, that we sort of move through our lives with blinders on to what's actually going around in our world. Then we can maybe just be more aware of things. We can notice things. Putting things together instead of tearing them apart. This was a great one from Occupy. Making room for difference instead of dividing. So there's 2 places in the creation stories where God doesn't say it's good, and it's when things are separated. Heaven from earth and light from dark. And I had never noticed that. Did you bring that up also? Right. So Bill's sort of sub-preaching. I'm just saying I'm just like Bill said. But it is interesting that in the story, everything that's generative, everything that's making room, everything that's sort of growing and expanding and creating beauty and order, God says is good. In the 2 situations where God doesn't say it's good is where things are divided, where things are separated. Speaking of which, the only non-good in the story, and this is the first non-good in the entire Bible, is loneliness, right? And so if you think about, and really the creation story is a poem. God said, and it was, and behold, it was good. God said, and it was, and behold, it was good. It was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good. And then there's this abrupt downshift. It is not good. After all the good in a row, it is not good for people to be alone. And so maybe the practice is just being together. We are not wired for loneliness. We're not wired to be alone. And I have this whole other sermon that I want to give sometime on how God is not enough. right? Because in the story, God is there, and God has already connected to the person, and God says it is not good for people to be alone, right? Anyway, speaking of together, let's break bread together. So the story isn't magic, right? These creation stories, they're not magic, and these beginning stories are not magic, but they take on significance in the telling. They're not sacred on their own. They become sacred when we tell them. And part of the reason is because the story alone doesn't have anything, right? It's only when it's with people, in the context of community, that it takes on this sort of like pushing and pulling and understanding and listening. Just like the bread, it doesn't become more until it's broken and shared. This meal, the story that Jesus tells, he doesn't tell ex nihilo either. Right? Jesus has tons of imagination, I'll give him that. But he also creates by analogy. Right? That's one of his primary ways of teaching. You've heard it said, I say. Right? He doesn't go, listen, I have a whole new teaching. It's this thing you've never heard before. He goes, you've heard this already. Let me tweak that a little bit. There's already a meal. There's already a memory. It's called the Seder. He picks it up and riffs on it. Right? He says, it's like the Seder meal, but imagine this is my body and blood. This is like the Exodus meal, but it's like a new journey. It's like a new kind of freedom. This is like a covenant, but it's like a new covenant. It's not ex nihilo. It's all of the things that have been a part of their story all along. He says it's like this, but new. When we remember Jesus, we remember hearing stories being told and telling new stories. We remember the creative and subversive resistance of love and justice. We remember empathy and imagination, which always call us to action. And we remember a way of being that invites us to start over, to begin again, to be made new over and over and over. The table of this new beginning, of this fresh way of being, has been set for us tonight. As always, it's open to us and to all people. And no one will ever be turned away. When you're ready, feel free to come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.